Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for Telling a More Compelling Story with Interactive Prototypes. Our speaker today is Matt Ray. Matt is a designer advocate and XD instructor for Adobe. He has 10 years of experience in product design across a variety of industries. In his talk, Telling a More Compelling Story with Interactive Prototypes, he'll show you how to bring your static screens to life in Adobe XD. We'd love to give a huge thank you to Adobe XD and Matt for partnering with us for the conference, and make sure to visit them at their booth in the expo area. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand things over to Matt. Welcome.
Thank you. You just saved me a few minutes of time. Now I don't have to introduce myself.
Happy to help.
We'll start with the screen share. All right. So welcome everybody. I hope you're all enjoying UX Y'all. I hope y'all are enjoying UX Y'all. Today, we're going to talk about telling a better story with interactive prototypes. I'm going to try and blend together a mini talk with a mini demo. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, I'm Matt. As Audrey mentioned, I'm a design advocate for XD. Feel free to reach out to me here, either by email, Twitter, LinkedIn. Twitter's probably your fastest response. And yes, as Audrey mentioned, I'm coming from about 10 years in product design or UX design, and it's been across several different industries. And over that time, I've worked with a lot of different people. There's been a broad cast of characters and organizational differences. Through that time, I've made many mistakes. I could do another 30-minute session just on the failures. But today we're going to stick with the lessons learned. I've learned quite a few on the way. And one of the main lessons I've learned through this time is that designer's job is rarely just about shipping pixels and pushing pixels and how things look. At some point in the history of design, that's kind of what it was seen as. You'd create mockups, hand those off, but it's far beyond that. And depending on the organization, depending on your own skill sets and how a company perceives design, you play a broader role far beyond just the production of digital assets or print assets. And that the lesson there is that designers are really critical communicators and can be very influential within an organization. And part of that is our skill set. We have an ability to communicate visually. We have an ability to understand people in ways that other skill sets don't. And so one of the tools in our tool belt is the interactive prototype. And I'm talking about like rich interactions, not just stringing images together with transitions and dissolves. We're talking about more rich, true to life interactive prototypes because they can add a lot of value. And if we look at the definition of what a prototype is, it's essentially an original model. It's that basis that everything else is built off of. So when we're thinking about prototypes, in the past, mockups and static screens may have been valuable for what we were designing, but the experiences we're creating have evolved so much, nothing is really static about them. And so building our prototypes should reflect what we're actually building and creating and designing. So we want to test the feel, not just the look. And to do that, we need interactivity. So how can we use interactive prototypes? Well, there's some of the obvious ones, user testing. Throughout my time in design, I found that there's a lot of struggles with user testing, from building the tests, to getting valuable results, to booking. There's a whole bunch of issues designers often face with user testing. But one of the things I find most is that there's not enough investment in user testing. And when we think about the time it takes to build a user test or build a user flow, some people kind of claw back and like, oh, that's too much effort for the results. There was another point I was going to make on that, but for the sake of time, I'll keep on moving. It'll probably come back to me later. The other one is design critiques. So in the same way as user testing, there it is. The information we can actually gather from a user test will change depending on how we build the prototype or the user test. So if we're building something, typically when we were dealing with images and kind of linking screens together, that took a lot of work to produce. And so we'd have to kind of create these carved out paths of what the journey might look like, little snapshots. But then we'd kind of find ourselves talking to users and be like, okay, so this is the exact situation we're testing. And make sure you kind of hit those buttons because these ones don't work yet because we haven't hooked that up. And that's all because the tooling wasn't there to really give us efficient ways of creating those prototypes. Moving into design critiques in a similar way, now we're all kind of remote, we're asynchronous in some capacities, and there can be a lot of communication gaps that pop up from that. And so adding the clarity, adding interactivity can help close that gap because it can help answer some of the questions like, okay, what does this button do when you click on it? Or what happens when I hover on this section? You can actually fill in those gaps and spend more time talking about the actual experience and giving feedback rather than asking these questions, which sometimes those questions are valuable, but it might not be the feedback you need. And then in a similar way of closing off communication gaps, of course, development handoff, I put it in quotes because it's more of a relationship. It's ongoing. It shouldn't just be a one inflection point handoff. But this relationship between design and development, we have two different ways of communicating, two different ways of understanding. And so there's often a lot of gaps. And I've worked with developers that are super literal and will build in and implement the red lines on a mockup if I hand them a screenshot. And then there's others that can kind of follow along with your vision. And you can sketch something on a napkin and they'll build it out. Both true stories. So using a prototype, we can answer some of those questions for developers as well of how does this interact? What happens when I do this? What happens when there's an empty state? We can fill in a lot more of these voids and then pair it with things like in XD, you can record your prototype with narration. And so when you're working asynchronously, sharing that video can be really powerful. And I've had situations where there was just this perpetual disconnect between design and development. And then once we started using recorded walkthroughs of these interactive prototypes, paired with specs, paired with the actual interactions, it made things so much cleaner, and development teams and design teams just got along so much better because there wasn't this headbutting and communication gap. So they can be very powerful there as well. But as we take kind of a look away from what we'd think of the traditional uses for prototypes, we can kind of dive into the rest of the organization. And so design culture can be a touchy subject, but I've worked in several different companies, each with their own kind of perspective on design and user experience. And when you go in and start in engineering heavy organizations, speaking from experience, there can be a lot of work to kind of change that perspective. And for me, in my experience there, design was kind of like the layer on top. Literally received messages that said, hey, this feature's coming out, can we put a UI on it? And it just made me cringe. And that's kind of the culture I was in when I started at that company. And so over time, we started leveraging interactive prototypes to do various things. So not only did we communicate with design and development and product management, but going beyond that, you can go and work with, in this case, there was a lot of hardware and software teams, and you can kind of use those prototypes as a way to kind of show what ideal scenario is, how can this benefit the user versus what we're doing today. And a lot of simple things like not showing the language in the API in the front end because that doesn't make sense to users. So using these prototypes, we slowly started rolling them out. We'd sit down with people, let them click through it and experience it themselves, feel what a failure might look like. So we built prototypes that had the failures built in. And over time, prototypes became more and more relevant in the company. They would get passed around. And then we'd get asked for assets so that these other teams could build them out themselves to articulate their vision. So by the end of kind of 2 years, it was a long time, then we started seeing prototypes showing up in engineering presentations and roadmap trajectories. UX just kind of floated right up to the top because prototypes helped communicate where the gaps were, where the failures were, and how we could improve it. So they're very powerful for influencing design culture and perspective within an organization. And then on the similar note, you can use them to showcase the vision. So rather than showing all the errors and like, here's the gaps, here's what we want to do, you can paint a vision with prototypes to bring people on board. And one of the biggest values to prototypes and prototyping in XD and other applications is that you don't have to lift an engineering finger to build it. There are definitely advantages to code prototypes, and they have a place when you're really trying to kind of define things. And there's limitations in prototyping apps where you can't do everything. So if you need live data, code-based prototypes could be helpful. But without lifting any kind of engineering fingers or spending money on development, you can do a lot to paint a vision with an interactive visual prototype. And in one of my past roles, we did just that. There was a lot of discrepancies on what we were building, who we're building for, from sales to development, different offices, disconnected. And so we actually built a full replica of the product in XD with all the interactivity. So we could then pull it out and say, okay, let's look at this area. Let's click through it. Here's kind of where we're changing. And then over time, we'd sub out sections and say, okay, this is the new vision that we're thinking for this section. So it gave us material to talk about with customers, internal stakeholders. Even though we weren't user testing, we were kind of validating ideas for the future using this mega prototype. So those are some of the cool ways to use prototypes and some new ones. I love prototypes, so I spend probably too long prototyping things. But that's really what got me into XD several years ago. I was living in Sketch and I just couldn't communicate the way I wanted to. So switching over to interactive prototypes, they really helped me and my teams tell a more compelling story. So with that, I think I split that right down the middle. So let's jump into a demo and show you how you can do that and take things from static into interactive pretty easily in XD. So first off, you can also do presentations in XD. I might be biased, but you can leverage the powerful tools like Auto Animate. Here is where you can record. So if you want to connect a microphone, you can play through your prototype and record it all. And now we're back in XD. So to start, we'll pop into this quick little demo. I'm not going to be able to go deep in 15 minutes or 10 minutes, but hopefully this will give you an idea of what is possible in XD. So if we start on this page here, this is kind of what we might be used to if we had done some design in Photoshop or Illustrator, where we just have like a static artboard. And that's helpful. I can understand how it works visually, but I can't scroll with it. And this is not how I'm going to see the website. So that's part of the problem with just handing off single page mocks, is it's not really in the context that I'm going to be experiencing it in. It's tall. I'm not going to see the footer. So first off, when we have an artboard in XD, we can create what's kind of called the viewport. So by turning on the scrolling section, and by default, when you use templates, artboard template, as soon as you resize it from the original size, it's going to drop this in this dotted blue line as kind of the marker of the bottom of the viewport. So just with that change, instantly our preview is more realistic. And I have some elements here fixed so that as I scroll, my navigation remains in place. And just a couple clicks like that, we have a more realistic prototype. So I don't have to take guesses of how this is going to look under the fold. You can see that I've fixed this little chat with us button. within the viewport window. I don't have to guess where it's going to end up on the page. I know I can just measure it roughly from this line, and I'm set. Now, that's great. But overall, we want to build in more interactivity. And you can see here, I really only have one page for each page. I'm not building out multiple artboards here to create a single flow. And I think that's been a hurdle in user testing in the past, where to do something simple like using a hover or just clicking on a button might take 3 different images strung together. And there's a whole bunch of management issues with that. If I make a change on one page, I then have to update all the others. And that's usually something that'll show up on user tests. I was like, why did that word change? It's like, it's because I built it wrong. So cutting things down and needing less artboards is also a nice management, not a headache reliever. You don't have to manage as many artboards to make sure. And the core behind that, and the reason why we don't need that, is components. And in XD, components are your reusable elements, and they can all contain different visual states and interactivity between those states. So let's first take a look at this component up here. This is our card that's going to show up for all of the activities. We're going to submit the activity images and text. But here, if I want to create a hover effect to make it clear that this is clickable, all I have to do is click on this plus in the component menu. And we even have hover and toggle states pre-built, so you don't even have to go to prototype mode to set them up. So I'm just going to start with a hover state. Now that that's selected, I can go in and change my visual properties. So I'll just tap into this image, and let's just do a nice little image zoom like that. Then maybe we can tap into this text and expand the arrow out, just a little subtle hint. Now I'm using something called a stack here that helps me control the spacing between elements. So I'm just going to double it up. And now we have our 2 different states, just like that. And because XD already wired this up with a hover interaction between them, I can just click play here. Should have used a larger artboard, but now as I hover, I just mouse over and XD does the rest with auto animate. So that's a nice simple hover. We can do the same thing on something like a button. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to repeat myself. Here we have that chat modal that I pointed to in the page layout. Now this is not, this is an instance. I'm not going to rebuild this because this one does take a couple different steps, but we're going to see it here in this dropdown. So this was our original component. I forgot to hide the expanded layer here, so that's why you're seeing a big green box. But here we've built in the default with a hover state, and then we've added an additional state here for the expansion. So when I play this, I can hover over that chat button, but I can also add a tap. So I can stack multiple interactions. And then within that, the actual chat window itself has different interactions if I hook them up right. I did not. Anyway, you can click on that box and actually go through a flow in the chat window itself. So now you're not only just building a open close toggle, you're actually going through what that experience in a chat window might look like. And the best part is that because it's a reusable component, as soon as I copy it, I get that same functionality built right into the page. Super simple. Now let's take a look at this drop-down menu. I think we're going to get through this whole demo and presentation in 30 minutes. That might be a record. So here we have a calendar date picker, just like we've seen here. And so on this page, this is an element that I want to reuse across multiple pages, but I don't want to spend time prototyping it every time. And so this is just a single component here. I can tap and expand open a calendar picker. I can then go a step further, just like the chat window. I can build more interactivity into that component and allow somebody to, say, scroll through this date picker if I wanted to, and allow them to actually interact with it on the page. And then I can close it, open another one. And this is all happening on a single artboard. This is not multiple pages. And so to build that, let's just take this group. We'll pull open our layer picker. So we have the expansion and the dropdown itself. I'm just going to use Command K, make it a component. And here we can even just use our toggle state and set this up. Now there's a relationship just like with a main component and instances. The default state can pass information down to the toggle state. So if you're animating anything in another state, it's helpful to include it, but just make it invisible on the default state. So here I'm going to take this picker dropdown. We're going to make sure it's below. So any of these changes I'm making in the default state are going to appear in the toggle state until I override them. So I'm just making sure everything's set up. I'm going to slide that down. And then we can use opacity. Opacity is best friend when animating things in and out. And then I'll hide that layer just to keep the bounds of the component tucked in here. Then I'll come to the toggle state. I'll turn the picker drop down back on, turn it up, and then place it in that final position. And that's all I need to do. You can see in here, I also have this scroll area set up so that somebody can actually interact with that. So when I play this, if I tap on that, again, haven't gone to prototyping mode. This is all just handled by XD, and it's toggling between these states. Now I have that. And as I scroll through, I can actually interact with the calendar, and I can go further and make each of those states with click actions so that the box can move. But for the sake of time, I didn't. But that's how simple it is to just create a simple dropdown with some interactivity inside of it. And you don't have to set up all your destinations on a main component. If I was setting this up, I could have everything within the component linked to different pages. So for example, if I'm building out a navigation, I can set these up and then have hover states, but then layer on top the actual navigation. So I can choose when I'm using an instance, which page that is going to go to. Or I can build it into the navigation if it's always going to go to the same page in my prototype. And the best part is every time that I then reuse that menu component, I don't have to rewire anything. It's always going to know I'm going to this page. So finally, one of my past jobs was working with autonomous vehicles and working in UI that was 90% map-based. And in the past, that's been almost impossible to do anything with. You just kind of had to tell people, imagine that you can scroll this view, or imagine this is clickable. And that doesn't really produce good results in user testing and design critique and painting a vision. It's just kind of useless. And so in XD, we can build in these pretty cool interactive map views. I won't go into too much detail on this today, but basically you can take a large screenshot like this. Here we have an image of Aspen, and then we can apply one of those scroll areas. So this one's going to be a vertical and horizontal. I can kind of resize it, and we're just going to tuck it within this frame, just like that. And so now when I play this, I can navigate through this map just like I would on a Google Maps canvas or any kind of mapping frame. The best part is I can actually add multiple elements. It doesn't just have to be the image. So in this case, let's take this little map marker and paste it into the map. We'll set it up right on Aspen, and this could even be a component itself. So if I mark that as a component, and let's just add a little hover state here where we will fill that maybe, and then maybe move the marker up. So now we have a default state with a hover. I can back out of this. And now when I play this, I can move around and all my components will still be interactive within that frame. So now I can have navigation links. I can do little nice hover states like this and build essentially a fully functioning map application in XD. So with that, I think we have 5 minutes left. that is a record timing. Hopefully you gain something valuable from this. And if you do want to explore more, I can point you to adobe.com/learnxd. And there's a whole bunch of tutorials and resources available here, from very beginner stuff to more advanced tutorials. And there will be a whole bunch more of this coming at the end of October when Adobe Max rolls out, and some even cooler features for advancing your prototyping and building really interactive prototypes. So I'm excited to come back at some point in the future and tell you about those features. But for now, check out max.adobe.com. And yeah, I don't know. Oh, do we have questions?
We do. Do you have time for some questions?
I do.
Awesome. So for our audience members who are listening, if you have a question, please make your way over to the Q&A and drop those in there. We also have a bunch of questions already in there, so go ahead and vote for your favorites so we can get to those first. But we'll get started with this first question. Can you talk about your experience with running mobile usability tests powered by Adobe XD prototypes? Any advantages or limitations you want to highlight?
Yeah, so I haven't done many mobile tests in a while. And in a role where I'm teaching in the last year or so, I haven't done any tests, frankly. But it depends on how you're using it, right? So in share mode, you can generate various different types of links, including a user testing link. All that's really doing is hiding all the Chrome that would be associated with the user, with XD. So it really just looks like you're opening an app. There are some limitations when you open that in on a phone, but if you're designing for an iPhone and you open it in Safari, you can actually interact with it on there. So in terms of distribution, that's really handy because I can open it on any device. You can also load it into the XD app on a phone. So if you're signed in, as you're using cloud files, you can just pull that file up. So if you are doing in-person, that can be really handy. Just like Sketch and Figma, this isn't doing any kind of data collection on your user test, but there's a lot of plugins that you can send it out, and they'll run the link just like you would on the phone. So, I mean, I can't really speak too much to advantages and limitations, but those are some handy features for getting it out there. And there's lots of plugins for connecting to the workflow you already use for running tests.
Awesome. Thank you. I know you might have mentioned this, but this one has the most amount of votes. Any new features in XD we can look forward to in the future? I don't know how much you're allowed to tell us.
Well, in a month, there will be some new cool features. Asset organization just dropped yesterday. So now you can create new groups in your asset panel. That one's not super exciting, but it's helpful for disorganized people like myself who want to be organized. Yeah, there's not much. This is unfortunately a public and recorded event, so I can't say anything other than I'm really excited. I've already built some cool, speaking of mobile testing, I've built a nice mobile app asset that I'm excited to roll out in a month, but that's about all I can say.
Totally understand, but thanks for sharing what you could.
No problem.
This next question, and currently our last, so if anyone has any other questions, please drop them in Q&A. But the question is, what about conditional logic? Is it planned to be implemented in the future?
Yeah, so this is one that I've wanted as well. I probably can't say anything definite, but it's definitely something the team has looked at and explored. I've seen some ideas around it in interactive prototypes. But there's ways to kind of work around it depending on what you're trying to build. And I don't have any of that demo set up. But with components, you can do what we call nested components. So I can take multiple components and put them into another component. and then build states on that main component. So let's say you have a checkbox state. If you're just doing single, like multiple choice selections, you can use that just as a basic toggle state and have many on the page. When you switch that to a radio button, for instance, you can only select one. So that ability to control other components doesn't quite exist. That would kind of be your conditional logic. But if you group that into a main component and then set your states off that, you can control which one is selected. And so you can go a step further. Let's say I have an example where there's three options, three different food options. And in theory, you'd want to be able to control, with conditional logic, a different flow based on that selection. So the hack is you put that in the submit button into one main component that has 4 states, one state for each selection. And then in each of those states, you can change the end link for the submit button and change which new flow it goes to. So though conditional logic isn't there, you can hack it in some way with nested components. And that's usually what I do.
That's great. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our questions. But before we go, we'd love for the audience to fill out a quick survey about their session. There's a pinned link in the chat, so if you want to go check that out, please do. And we want to just thank everyone again for attending, and thanks so much to Matt for doing this talk and demo for us. Sometimes I feel like, a lot of these discussions are kind of almost philosophical in nature, and sometimes it's really nice to get into the nuts and bolts of exactly what we do. So thank you so much for bringing that to UX Y'all.
No problem. And thanks for having me. And thanks everyone for listening.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone.